1. The Flare. My name is Brian Chambers. My job, within the context of this document, is to write down everything the members of the commune care to share. I was awarded this position, despite my best efforts to protest against it, primarily because I am familiar with shorthand, a skill left over from my college days. Some of our other members, who have fallen naturally into the position of elder, have determined that we should begin to keep records for those generations that come after us. I would add that concerns for such concepts as legacy and posterity naturally become the province of the aged. However, tact restricts me from saying this out loud. It is certainly possible that this record is found useful by some unknown reader at a later time. I honestly think it is just as likely that this is our way of leaving something behind. This is the evidence of our existence. The census, public records, and the sum total of all digital human knowledge are lost to us. We must be our own historians. The flare was what it was, what we all remember. One day you step outside, if you were lucky enough to be outside when it occurred, and saw what I can only describe as the northern lights on steroids. The dead of night, and there's enough light to read by, with some of the wildest colors dancing across the sky that you've ever seen, making everything all around you take on this otherworldly, ghostly appearance. This goes on for days, and you get used to it, of course. There was nothing on the news but coverage of the event. I saw more of Neil deGrasse Tyson's face on the TV in those few days than years' worth of wasting time on the internet. Those few days of remaining 24-hour cycle coverage became pretty interesting, if not outright fun. Suddenly, everyone was an amateur cosmologist weighing in on what they thought was coming next. The conspiracy theorists came falling out of the woodwork like they always do, and blamed it all on everything from space-based weapons systems to aliens. The journalists on TV ate all this garbage up, because what the hell else are you going to do with a 24-hour news cycle? And hit their expert guests with unceasing, breathless questions. What comes next? What are the rumors we're seeing on Reddit? What should our viewers at home be doing? At first, all the experts were very soothing. They almost fulfilled the role of hyperbole goalies, catching each idiotic or leading comment from the news anchors and pulling them, and everyone else, back down to reality. In the first day, all we heard were the few lines of calming mantra. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections, CMEs, are two different things and don't always occur at the same time. It's incredibly unlikely that a CME would be directed right at Earth given the distances involved. The Earth has this really neat thing called a magnetosphere in place to protect us from this kind of activity, and so on. A couple of days into the dazzling skylights, we started to notice the narrative change. The experts became less placating. We heard less and less about the likelihood, or lack thereof, of an impact to day-to-day life as a result of the solar event. We heard more and more side stories about disaster preparedness kits, how much water you should have stashed on hand, knowing the location of local community crisis management centers. Various local news stations started to broadcast the possibility of rolling brownouts as a mitigation tactic just in case something really gnarly was coming our way. I actually don't know if anything ever came of that. It seemed the officials had only just begun to discuss mitigation when all the lights went out. This was no normal outage either. I recall sparks jumping out of some of my wall sockets, and a few of the homes up the street burned down completely. We had already been living with the idea that something like this could happen for at least a few days by this point, so many of us started to filter outside from our houses. Usually you just stay inside, light a candle, and wait for your Wi-Fi to come back. It was evening, and I was standing around outside discussing the possibility of a block-wide barbecue with a neighbor when we all started hearing the crashing of the cars up and down the highway. Later on, some of us figured out that it probably wasn't every car that started crashing, just the newer, fancier ones that had fully electronic braking systems. It was a little after that when planes started falling out of the sky. Again, not all of them, just the really unlucky ones with electrically controlled hydraulic systems. Sometime later, once the news slowly started coming back online and being distributed through old-fashioned means, in many cases military personnel in old-school jeeps, we learned that the flare, as it was being called, was the single greatest solar flare/CME ever encountered in history, with a magnitude several times greater than the event recorded in the mid-1800s. I don't recall what that one's name was anymore, or when it was exactly. All in all, it was a massive, crippling blow to an overburdened power grid running at capacity. This wasn't just localized to North America either. Apparently, the only countries that hadn't been greatly affected were those of the Third World, with little to no infrastructure to speak of. Slowly, over the next few days, chaos bled quickly into mass insanity. At first, when everything went down, it was a nice change of pace. Many of us commented on how nice it was to unplug from the stupid TV for a few hours. By the second day, it was less like a little diversion and more like an unplanned camping trip. Still not so bad. After a week, water and sewage began to be a serious problem. The flare had effectively killed all of the satellites, which we were informed were now also on a slow, plodding collision course with the planet, so all but the slowest courier-based communication was offline. Supplies and relief were non-existent. You may or may not be old enough to remember Hurricane Katrina, but if you are, picture that times 10, only spread out across 20% or 30% of the planet. We were informed that we were collectively looking at about a 6-month recovery period just before the riots broke out and martial law was declared. This was also the same time that all news just stopped coming. It isn't that they weren't trying to get us information. The military in our area and the military couriers remained friendly with those of us who weren't behaving like fools. There just wasn't any new information to speak of. Life became very different over the next couple of months. We adapted to it. You'd be amazed what you can adapt to when you have no choice. Once things had calmed down, we heard some rumors here and there via the border of how things were going on down in Mexico and the rest of South America. Just those rumors were enough to make us grateful for what we had at home, tent cities and all. It seems the world has a way of delivering the second part of a 2-punch combo at the time when you can afford it the least. For us, that second punch was the plague.